What happens when you use an unusual method with sourdough and Tangzhong as well as rye flour to make an artisan bread? Well, you get this charming loaf that is versatile, delicious, and also pretty fun to make. Hey, Seraphin here, and today we're making this artisan sourdough bread. I like to think of this bread as a soft and crusty bread with an even crumb. It's a very versatile bread that can be eaten in a lot of ways. I think it makes fantastic breakfast toast, for example. Now, given that we use only 25% rye flour, this bread isn't meant to be considered a traditional rye bread, and indeed, whether in texture or appearance, it's much more like a regular wheat bread with the rye acting to provide flavor. Of course, as with basically all of our videos, this recipe is also based on science. In our previous video on rye, we covered the history of rye and the science of rye bread making in depth, so make sure to watch that video for more. For some background information, you see, it's definitely well known that wheat flour makes better bread doughs and thus better bread than rye flour. Wheat and rye are actually closely related, but their grains are different enough for their bread-making quality to be vastly different. Wheat has gluten proteins, which form a network that can hold in gas and make a viscoelastic dough. On the other hand, while rye also has gluten, it has less of it, and rye flour proteins don't come together to make a network like in wheat doughs. This is why when you use rye flour instead of wheat flour to make bread, you get very different doughs and breads. Now, there's more to it than just gluten, but we'll save that for a little later. For the time being, I want us to look at doughs made from blends of rye flour and wheat flour. At what point does the amount of rye flour start to significantly influence the bread? Well, according to this paper, doughs need to contain at least 60% wheat flour to make bread of proper quality. So a blend of 60% wheat flour and 40% rye flour is the base standard for a decent bread that has an acceptable bread volume. However, when the researchers studied a 20% rye flour blend, they found that it didn't significantly decrease the bread volume, which is a good thing. But we should also note that we're doing at least a few things very differently from the paper. Notably, the paper doesn't really talk about the starch in rye and the amylases. If we rewind a little bit and recall how we talked about the rye proteins being essentially useless in the structure of rye bread, well, the follow-up to that is to look at what actually does play a role in the structure of the rye bread. That's where the rye starch comes in. It absorbs water, and it's pretty important during baking. That's all fine, except that within the rye flour itself, we have several components dedicated to breaking down the starch. These are called amylase enzymes. To basically stop these enzymes from breaking down too much of the starch and causing various problems, rye bread has traditionally called for sourdough. The acidity of the sourdough inactivates much of the amylase activity, which solves this problem. Now, the paper doesn't use sourdough, and it also doesn't mention the use of acidifying ingredients in the bread dough to mitigate amylase activity. So, with the use of sourdough, we could possibly get away with using more of the rye flour, which is what we do in this recipe. Aside from lowering amylase activity, sourdough also converts water unextractable arabinoxylans into water extractable arabinoxylans, which is a good thing, given that the water unextractable arabinoxylans are known to make the bread both harder and lower in volume. So we've looked at why we use 25% rye flour and sourdough, but we still have one more thing to talk about, which is our more uncommon method of using the Tangzhong to make Levain. Although it's not exactly the same, this paper examines a similar method of bread making. The term used for the method is fermented scalding being a technique traditionally used with rye bread. I talk more about scalding in my previous video on rye bread, but in this paper, the method they're using to scald the rye flour is relatively similar to what we do with our rye Tangzhong here. The end results of using fermented scald were overall pretty positive. I have to say, given that we used 25% rye flour here, I can't say how much these results have in common with our bread dough, but the dough we're making is nice and workable. The bread is soft, and even better yet, it is very flavorful. Scalds and Tangzhong or Yudane are known to sweeten bread subtly, and I definitely think that happens here. Okay, with all this out of the way, let's get into the recipe. Now, just a quick reminder before we start making the bread, this is a sourdough recipe, so the fermentation times may vary depending on your starter, and they will definitely vary depending on your room temperature. That's why you should adjust the recipe as needed and use the timing as a baseline metric. Okay, first we make the Tangzhong. This is done a day before making the final dough, and here we've got the rye flour already measured out, as well as a glass bowl on the scale. Now we'll measure in the boiling hot water, adding in the rye flour right after that. And we mix it all together with a spatula. The nice thing about making a rye tangzhong is that the rye starch has a lower gelatinization temperature than wheat starch, so we don't have to be so concerned with making sure to add in the flour as quickly as possible. It's also quite interesting to see how much the color changes from light to a dark brown shade. When the tangzhong has become smooth and homogeneous like this, we're done. We'll clean the sides of the bowl and the spatula. Then, setting the spatula aside, we'll cover the bowl with a silicone cap. This is actually something about making tangzhong that I recently changed my mind about. I used to place a cloth underneath the silicone to catch the vapor, but upon further thinking, I thought it would be better to cover the bowl properly and keep that moisture inside. After all, the bowl isn't that hot, and it's better to retain as much water as possible. So we leave the tangzhong to cool to room temperature before putting it in the fridge overnight. And the next morning, we're going to start making the levain. So we'll get the tangzhong out of the fridge, and we've got all the other ingredients here already prepared, including the sourdough starter. It's important to make sure that the starter is in the right condition when the microorganisms are at the peak of their population. It should be light and airy like you see here. Next, in a large mixing bowl on top of the scale, we're going to measure in this sourdough starter. You could do this in a smaller bowl for ease of storing the levain, but since I'm making the bread dough in one day, I'll just be using the same bowl to make the dough later. If you want to leave the levain to rest overnight, you might want to use a smaller bowl, of course. And then we add in the tangzhong, using a spatula to scrape it in. It's going to be cold and stiff, we'll just let it drop in and scrape down the bowl. Following that, with the rye flour, tossing it all in. We're going to start mixing this with a spatula now, breaking up the tangzhong into smaller chunks and roughly matching everything together. We'll do this for about a minute, and then we're going to switch to using our hands. Before that though, we'll grab a scraper and clean off the spatula on both sides. It's sticky, so this can take a second. Then we mix with our hands. It's going to be dry and very stiff in the beginning. That's perfectly fine. This circular motion that I'm doing is the best way I've found to just mix it all together, although any method of mixing is, of course, okay. It shouldn't take too long to get everything combined, but you do want to make sure that the starter is well distributed throughout the levain, as well as ensure all the rye flour is hydrated. When the levain is well mixed like it is here, we're going to clean off our hands with the scraper, and then the sides of the bowl. We'll tidy everything up. Then we cover the bowl and leave the levain to ferment for about 3 hours at room temperature, or for about as long as it takes for the levain to puff up to about 1.5 times its original volume. It should become lighter and airier. You could also leave the levain overnight in the fridge to build more flavor, although I should note that because rye flour contains a lot of flavor precursors already, leaving it overnight would just add more flavor to an already flavorful profile, which is why you can think of this as being more optional. We've got our mise en place set up here, so we'll start by adding the water into the bowl, pouring it in, and following that with the salt. Before we add the bread flour, we're going to mix this with a small spatula. We'll break the levain into smaller pieces and dissolve the salt in the water. And less than a minute later, we add in the bread flour, tapping it in. Now, we're going to combine the flour into the other ingredients with the spatula first. Steadily, we're folding the flour into the wet levain, bringing it together. When it becomes too stiff to mix with a spatula, we'll clean off our spatula with a scraper, getting both sides. And then we switch to mixing it with our hands. This is a sticky dough and it's very wet and slack, so we can't knead it at all. So we're just going to do our best to essentially fold the flour in. You could use any motions you like, but this circular motion is pretty convenient at mixing this dough. We want to make sure the dough is homogeneous when the dough is done. So we're checking here to see if there's any loose flour or streaks of unmixed levain. Once it's well mixed like this, we're going to clean off our hands with the scraper. And I will note again that this is a sticky dough. It may take a minute or two to get all of the dough off. And after that, we clean down the sides of the bowl, simply tidying up. We can also use the spatula to clean off the scraper. By the end, the dough should look like this, and we're just going to cover it. We're going to leave it to rest for 30 minutes before doing our first set of stretch and folds. Okay, so when the dough's 30 minutes are up, we're going to uncover the bowl, dip our hands into the bowl of water, and then we pull the dough up, stretching it out before folding it down. We repeat that 3 more times, 4 stretch and folds in total. It won't be very extensible in the beginning, but later on as the gluten develops, it should get a lot better. It takes less than 5 minutes to complete, and when we're done, we'll cover the bowl again and leave the dough to rest for another 30 minutes. So after another 30 minutes, we repeat the same set of 4 stretch and folds. Now, the 30 minutes between stretch and folds is really just there to let the dough relax between sets and prevent the dough from ripping too much. And here we cover the dough again and let it rest for another 30 minutes. Then it's time for our final stretch and fold. At this point, you should be able to see that the dough has developed some gluten and stay cohesive. It might be a bit tight, which is perfectly fine. It's actually a good sign. We'll flip the dough over after the stretch and folds. And following that, we'll cover the bowl again. We'll let the dough ferment for another 40 minutes. After the dough is done fermenting, it should have risen to double its original volume, becoming a nice and airy dough. So we'll uncover the bowl, remove the silicone mat underneath it. Then we'll sprinkle some bread flour onto the top of the dough, as well as onto our work surface. Scraping down the sides. And then we get the dough out, flipping it over onto the work surface. We want to pre-shape this in a super simple way, folding in the 4 sides of the dough like this. The dough is pretty sticky, so we're keeping the scraper close and adding a bit more flour here and there as needed. Flipping the dough over and rounding it with our palms. When the dough is round like this, we're good. We'll use a bowl from just now to cover the dough. While we leave it, we'll give the dough 20 minutes to relax a bench rest. While the dough rests, we're going to prepare its proofing spot, which is a simple bowl here with a cloth to line it. We want to thoroughly dust this cloth in rice flour. This will greatly help in preventing the dough from sticking to it, so make sure to cover every spot with rice flour. After that, we'll set the bowl aside, and when the dough's bench rest is over, we can start shaping the dough. First things first, we want to uncover the dough and dust a bit of bread flour on top of it, and onto the work surface, of course. We then use a scraper to flip the dough over. We'll basically be folding the dough like a parcel. So the sides in first, like this, and then the bottom and the top, making sure that the last fold goes over the midway line, really building tension on the dough's surface. We then flip the dough over and round it out with our hands. You may need a bit more flour here and there to prevent sticking. When the dough looks round and smooth, we're good. So before the dough goes into the proofing container, we're going to give it a nice coating of bread flour, spreading the flour all over the dough, rounding it a little more. And then we give it another layer of rice flour. This is done to further prevent the dough from sticking to the cloth lining the bowl. It's better to brush the excess flour off later rather than have to detach a sticky dough from the cloth. We'll grab the proofing bowl now and drop the dough in, making sure to dust the bottom of the dough as well. We cover the bowl and we want to let the dough proof for 2 hours or until it almost doubles in size. While the dough rises, we're also taking the time to preheat the oven, and the Dutch oven we're using to 250 degrees Celsius. When the dough is done rising and our oven is ready, it's baking time. Using a wooden board, we transfer the dough onto a piece of parchment paper. Make sure to do this gently because we don't want to degas the dough. Then we'll bring out the preheated Dutch oven, being very careful with the heat. We'll brush off the excess flour on the dough and then quickly score the dough with a lame. I'm doing a classic round swipe like this to get a bold ear on my bread. There are other ways to score the dough, of course. Then we'll slide the dough into the Dutch oven, covering it and putting everything into the oven. We bake with the lid on at 250 degrees Celsius for 20 minutes before removing the lid and baking at 220 degrees Celsius for another 25 minutes or until it reaches the desired shade of dark golden brown. Each oven is different, so make sure to adjust the settings to your oven. It's important to keep in mind that this is a Tangzhong bread dough, so you should make sure to bake it for longer to let it dry out. Otherwise, you risk the bread having a sticky and dense texture. And when the bread is done baking, we are done. As with basically all bread, patience is important here. You don't want to cut into the bread while it's still warm because that would cause it to become gummy. So we'll be patient and let the bread cool down on a wire rack before we slice it open. The way that this bread looks and how it expanded at the score is likely to be because of the rye flour in the recipe. It creates a very lively appearance, to say the least. And this is how the crumb looks, soft and airy. It is a bit denser than a regular wheat bread, but its intense flavor and increased softness make up for that. It smells delightful as well. This bread definitely benefits from all the sourdough fermentation and the rye flour. It makes for a complex swirl of flavors that taste both rich and satisfying. Also, it looks amazing. Just a gorgeous loaf of bread, if I do say so myself. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching and bye!